Hi, just a little bit of a thumbnail of T S Eliot, his life, which will help. So I'm going to follow on with some talk about Burnt Norton and some notes on that. By the 1940s, T S Eliot was a public figure, a major poet. In 1948, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and in 1948, which was the same year that he won that, his wife Vivian died. And in 1957, so that's 9 years later, he married his secretary Valerie Fletcher. So he's born on the 26th of September 1888, and he died in 1965, which would have made him 76 years old. 17th century ancestors. His father came from East Coker in Somerset, and in 1906 he was at University at Harvard reading the classics. He had a year in Paris where he studied French literature and philosophy, and he was in Paris in 1910. And in 1911 he took his PhD on the work of the philosopher Bradley, but it was not published, incredibly, until 1964. So he sort of came away from that and concentrated on his writing in the interim. In 1914 he came to England and he was at Oxford for a year. And then we move on from there. Just take that light down like that. Move on from there. He became a British citizen in 1927 and a friend of Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound's dates are 1895 to 1972, which would have made him 77 when he died. Huge influence on T S Eliot. T S Eliot would ask Ezra Pound to review his own work. And Ezra Pound, he was the one who crossed out so much of the wasteland and put "start here, April is the cruelest month." And there's evidence that he helped him enormously with the writing of Murder in the Cathedral as well, which is, in my opinion, T S Eliot's crowning masterpiece. And of course, Ezra Pound recognised that T S Eliot was a genius and did it the best he could to promote his poetry. In 1915, he married Vivian Haig Wood, which was an unhappy marriage, unfortunately, not least because Vivian herself suffered tremendously from mental anguish. There's an occasion when she interrupted one of his lectures, in a rather frenzied way, stories like that. He was actually a school teacher for 2 years, and in 1917 joined Lloyd's Bank, where he worked for 8 years. But while he was working there, he also worked very hard on his writing and his various reviewing of work, which he did quite a lot of. So he was an editor of The Egoist from 1917 for a couple of years, and The Criterion for much longer, 1922, until the outbreak of war, 1939. He was very involved in literary criticism and indeed brought certain poets into the limelight for others to study. He drew attention to the genius of various poets, including, for example, John Dryden. His health was bad in October 1921, and he had to actually leave the bank to go to Margate on what you might call a sickness leave, I suppose. He also went to Switzerland, but in 1922, during that time, he completed The Wasteland. Then you have The Hollow Men in 1925, and he joined in 1925 the publishers Faber and Gaia, which is now Faber and Faber, and he worked for the rest of his life there. In 1927 is a big year for T S Eliot. This was the year he converted to Christianity, and I believe he was 39 years old at that time. And I believe that if you read the Journey of the Magi and compare the work before and after his religious conversion, you'll notice how his religious ideas very much informs the hope in his poetry. Ash Wednesday, 1927-30, and then the four quartets. Now, it's the four quartets I'm going to look in more closely at in a minute, including starting with Burnt Norton. 1936 he wrote them. But strangely, a few years later, 1942, that's only 6 years on, there was no significant poetry. He sort of focused more on the plays that he wrote. So that's 23 years of his life where he didn't write much more poetry. It's very odd, I believe. Very strange. So he wrote The Rock, which was a pageant play, Sweeney Agonistes, 1934, Murder in the Cathedral, my favourite, 1935. So he was 47 years old when he wrote that. The Family Reunion, 1939. The Cocktail Party, 1949. The Confidential Clerk, 1954. The Elder Statesman, 1958. And a lot of these were, in fact, verse dramas. So I suppose his outlet for his poetry was in that form. That was really his final phase. So a fascinating life, full of, if you get the prose writings of T S Eliot, there are 4 big volumes, and if you dip into them, all of them are brilliantly written. His work as a literary critic and as a philosophical critic too. One that springs to mind is where he pulled apart Bertrand Russell's philosophies. Incredibly clever man and knowledgeable and learned. And his work is endlessly fascinating. It's regarded as some of the most obscure poetry ever written, in some ways, because you need to refer to so many other different poets and ideas to make sense of it. But if it was written in the form of a philosophical essay, that would be one thing. But he decided to express his ideas in a poetic form, and it's that poetic form that interests me more so actually than than the philosophical ideas behind it. So it's the actual poetry itself I'm interested in. So in my next video, I'll be looking at the beginning of Burnt Norton and trying to make sense of some of those lines and trying to throw some light on the beauty of the poetry. Thank you for listening.